Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. One of the most annoying things about white colonial rule is the way they treated the blacks. They're patronizing. Blacks, it doesn't matter. Just because you are black, you were considered such an inferior individual that it doesn't matter your age, your intellect, it doesn't matter. You were always treated as somebody who was not a full shilling, let's put it that way. You could not make any decision. Of course, one of the blatant ways of denying blacks that they are competent in any meaningful way was to deny them the vote. Blacks didn't have a vote in the same sense that a 10-year-old today does not have a vote. So you were always considered to be condemned, to be born, live. It doesn't matter how old you are when you die, you always be condemned to have the mental intellect of a 10-year-old. That's why you can't be trusted with something as important as a vote. One of the annoying things about our independence in Zimbabwe in 1980 is Zanu PF has come to replicate that. It is now 44 years since our independence, and the country is yet to hold free, fair, and credible elections. Because Zanu PF does not trust the ordinary Zimbabwean with a vote. Yes, on paper, people have got the right to vote. But ours is something called a directed, manipulated vote. Our vote only counts if it is a vote for Zanu PF. Otherwise, it does not count. The party has always found ways of labeling the opposition puppets of the West. And therefore, then anyone who votes for a puppet must be a 10-year-old. And that vote can be considered to be a serious vote. It's an irresponsible vote. And it is Zanu PF's duty to make sure that there's no regime change. I've got on the screen a video of ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula. In one of his speeches in 2022, hardly 2 years ago, he was reiterating Zanu PF's point of view that the people of Zimbabwe do not have the intellect to have a meaningful vote. And therefore, then any electoral process that will try to bring in regime change in Zimbabwe cannot be the democratic wish of the people of Zimbabwe, at least those with any intellect. So it must be interrupted. No one can deny that Zanu PF has rigged elections since 1980. Particularly our neighbors, like South Africans, they know the history of Zimbabwe only too well to dispute that. And yet here we are, ANC Secretary General, making it abundantly clear that an election in Zimbabwe that will seek regime change of Zanu PF can only be because the blacks themselves, the opposition, are puppets, and their supporters voting for a puppet. You cannot be a full shilling if you're going to vote for a puppet. Let's just listen to the clip of him speaking.
Even here in Zimbabwe, Mbeki stood firm. They wanted Mugabe to be changed overnight, and then they attack us on what is called quiet diplomacy. This South Africa's quiet diplomacy is a problem. And then we said, we don't subscribe to regime change policy, that governments must be changed willy-nilly through undemocratic means, through military power. Because America can move right from Botswana in the afternoon, Mugabe will be finished. Because they are here in Botswana. Yes, they move in the afternoon, by dinner, everything will be sorted. We opposed the sanctions, and then we said these sanctions against Zimbabwe will be detrimental to the growth of Zimbabwe and everything. Mnangagwa conducted a coup d'etat and removed Mugabe. What is the state of affairs? They are still not satisfied. Till they get their puppet into power, they will never be satisfied. Zimbabwe is still under sanctions despite the fact that Mugabe was removed. Mugabe went to grave as a changed president by his own comrades in Zimbabwe, Mnangagwa. He brought Zimbabwe, but they did not want those reforms because they want a man called Chamisa. Is it Chamsa or Chamisa? They want him there to be the leader, the new leader of Zimbabwe, of a new Zimbabwe. In the meantime, Zimbabwe as a country has moved to South Africa. From Gugulethu to Khayelitsha, there's Zimbabwe there. The whole country, Zimbabwe, has moved to South Africa. And then we say to the Americans and we say to the British, give the Zimbabweans what they deserve. Because you agreed in Lancaster that you will give them 40 billion pounds for land reform and redistribution program.
I'll stop it there. I think this issue of mixing the land reforms with Zimbabwe's failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections is something that is of a red herring. Whether America and the British and the West did not give Zanu PF the money is no excuse for Zanu PF's failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections. What has that got to do with the ordinary Zimbabwean who is being denied their fundamental right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country? The quarrel that Zanu PF has with Americans and the British has nothing to do with them. Since 1980, Zanu PF has repeatedly failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. That history is well known. And neighbors like South Africa or South African neighbors here ANC know that history well enough. One of the things that we have congratulated and we have celebrated with South Africans is that they were able to honor their liberation struggle promises of making sure that all South Africans are free, enjoy justice, and have an equal say in the governance of the country. South Africa owe it to its iconic leader, the late Nelson Mandela, that the country, when it gained its independence in 1994, retained healthy and functioning democratic institutions, a free media, a free judiciary, the police, the army, and so forth have maintained their non-partisan position. ANC is well aware of those things. And yet, here we are, 2022. ANC want to pretend that Zimbabwe, the only way there could be regime change in Zimbabwe is Zimbabweans themselves voting for a puppet. If indeed Nelson Chamisa is a puppet, if he is voted by the people of Zimbabwe in a free, fair, and credible election, what is that to ANC? Zimbabwe is not a province of South Africa. If that is the democratic will of the people of Zimbabwe, why is South Africa interfering and saying, no, we don't want regime change? Who are you to say it's regime change? Who are you to say the people themselves are incompetent? They don't want regime change. This is back to what we were experiencing before independence. We blacks were denied the vote because our intellect, our mental capacity was a 10-year-old. We never grew up above that. And how can somebody, a 10-year-old, have a meaningful say in the governance of the country, have a meaningful vote for something that he or she doesn't understand? And that is exactly the same thing we are seeing here. Eddie Cross, an MDC, a senior MDC member, told Free Talk in a recent interview a few months ago now that in 2012 or thereabout, ANC asked their deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs to carry out a thorough investigation into what would be the implications of Zanu PF losing power in Zimbabwe. And the report came back and said if Zanu PF was to lose power in Zimbabwe, and we've got to remind ourselves here that 2012 was the time when there was a GNU in Zimbabwe. And the GNU had shown that the economic meltdown that had happened, which had led to Zanu PF nearly losing power, if it was not for the blatant rigging in 2008, had been arrested, the country's economy did definitely improved under the GNU. Indeed, in 2009, the economy grew by a staggering 12% as compared to the previous year, when it had shrunk by minus 6%. So ANC Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs' report was absolutely correct. If Zanu PF was to lose power in Zimbabwe, and the new opposition party was to emerge, and the country's economy was to improve, South Africans will see that. And they will also realize, wait a minute, here in South Africa, the South African economy is in serious trouble. Indeed, by this year, many people correctly said that although South Africa is not a failed state yet, it has made significant strides in that direction. Corruption was rampant. It was gross mismanagement. And things like load shedding have become a norm in South Africa. Zimbabweans are well familiar with things like that. But probably many people never thought they would see that happen in South Africa, but it did. So ANC was worried. The only way they could maintain their own power is to make sure that there was no regime changes in Zimbabwe. So all this talk about, oh, the Americans are the ones who want regime change, it's just a smokescreen to hide the real truth, that the ANC was determined to keep Zanu PF in power no matter what. The 2023 elections, ANC in the 2022 Congress, ANC made a party resolution that they will not accept regime change in Zimbabwe. That's how determined the party was. Again, one has got to ask, if the people of Zimbabwe voted for regime change, what has that got to do with ANC? Is Zimbabwe a province of South Africa, where South Africa has got to say, well, as a federal state, we cannot allow regime change? Indeed, for a country that is itself has been holding free, fair, and credible elections, to come up with such an outrageous statement was absolutely amazing. But they did. That's how desperate ANC was to keep Zanu PF in power. And of course, Mnangagwa read the message very loudly and very clearly. He did go on to blatantly rig the 2023 elections, as we all know. But the SADC election observer team judged the elections on the basis of the evidence before them, and they condemned the process as flawed and illegal, much to the annoyance of ANC leadership, I'm sure. In SADC as a region, they adopted that damning report. ANC, President Ramaphosa and company decided to ignore SADC's report and went ahead and endorsed Zanu PF strict elections. President Ramaphosa and his ANC friends, high power delegation, attended Mnangagwa's inauguration. President Ramaphosa was one of the 3 African heads of state in the world over who attended the inauguration. A clear indication that many of the other countries were displeased, particularly SADC and the AU. They both condemned it. And so any head of state from SADC or the AU, you've got to ask yourself, if you believe that the electoral process was flawed and illegal, that regime is illegitimate. What are you doing attending the inauguration of somebody who is illegitimate? And they heeded that warning, but not President Ramaphosa and our friend here. When President Ramaphosa went back to South Africa, he was greeted by the media there, and they had to answer a lot of awkward questions why he had attended. A clear indication that South Africans themselves were aware of what was going on here. In this year's election, in May, 29th of May, the people of South Africa decided that they would not give ANC the overwhelming majority that it had enjoyed the first 30 years of that country's independence. For the first time ever, ANC found itself having to form a coalition government if they wanted to remain in power. And some of the coalition partners have made it abundantly clear that ANC's position of propping up the corrupt and tyrannical Zanu PF regime is something that they're totally unhappy about. And guess what? There's been a video on social media telling our friend Bulula to his face that ANC's relationship with Zanu PF is over. Boy, you have to see it, to see his reaction.
Our international relationship is going to really be based off what is good for South Africa, and ensure that this countries respect the rule of law. We will not be associated with dictators and with countries that actually does not respect the human rights of their own countries. Not that we will interfere directly in their affairs, but we will make it really very clear. Like I can give an example that I always use. It's Zanu PF in Zimbabwe. I mean, it's going to be almost impossible, not difficult for Action SA to have relationships with Zanu PF. Looking at their history, you know, making Zimbabweans to be all over the world, including being here in South Africa, creating a massive challenge for us as South Africa. Zimbabwean people deserve to be in their own country. Got a beautiful country, lots of potential, but unfortunately when you have a party like the Zanu PF, which friends of the ANC, I really find it difficult for a current government to be associated with the Zanu PF. I mean, it's beyond imagination.
Jesus. There is somebody who is feeling really uncomfortable, and rightly so too. The relationship, the symbiotic relationship between the ANC and Zanu PF is over. And thank God for it. Many people have said that if ANC is to retain its influence in South African politics, there's got to be renewal in that party. I'm not here to determine to call out what renewal means. But if I had anything to do with it, I would say yes. Some of the ANC leaders of the last 30 years have allowed corruption and mismanagement and some of the most idiotic decisions to be made, including this symbiotic relationship with Zanu PF. That was not a mistake. That shows a sign of leadership that is rotten to the core. And such leaders, in my view, will never reform. They simply must go. As for Zimbabwe, I had predicted myself that the failure of ANC to win power in South Africa was a game changer. It has proven to be exactly that. It's hardly a month since the 29th May election results. And already the cold, chilling winds, political change across the Limpopo River are being felt by Zanu PF. They know it will never be business as usual. This idea that somehow because they are the party of the revolution, they've got the divine right to rule, is totally unsustainable. SADC's damning report of last year's election was adopted by SADC and it still remains valid. What does that mean? It clearly means that Zanu PF is illegitimate. SADC may not have had the courage to say so publicly for various other reasons. But the fact still remains. The regime, the Zanu PF regime, is illegitimate. And Zanu PF must know, as much as the party is desperate to rig the 2028 elections, they must know that rigging those elections and getting away with it will be near impossible. Without South Africa this time, I honestly don't see how SADC can stomach another rigged elections in Zimbabwe. Of course, we Zimbabweans have got to do our bit. We are the ones who have got to make sure that we do not participate and give SADC the excuse to give Zanu PF legitimacy. We are not going to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. That is obvious. The regime has got already majority in parliament In fact, thanks to these recalls by Tsavangu, they've got 2/3 majority. Parliament is not going to implement any meaningful reforms. The little sprinkling of CCC MPs and senators, I think anybody who thinks that they are going to put the regime under pressure is naive, to say the least. These are the same individuals who failed to implement the democratic reforms when they had the golden chance to do so during the GNU. It is naive to think they'll do so now. One thing we can count on is that the likes of Nelson Chamisa would want to convince his followers that he can win the 2028 elections without any reforms. He will try to con his followers to participate in the flawed elections in their millions, as they did in 2023. And when there are people participate in their millions, it really puts SADC under an increased pressure, because they will have to say, if the ordinary Zimbabweans are happy with the flawed process, surely SADC should not interfere. Our challenge is to make sure that these naive and ignorant CCC followers, I must say, and I'm ashamed to admit it, that there is a lot of personality cult mentality with this Chamisa chete. You can't reason with somebody who is in that mental state. They will participate. It won't take much, a day's work for Chamisa to persuade them to participate yet again in flawed elections. Even after being warned that the result is predetermined and participating will only give Zanu PF legitimacy, they will still participate. One of the tragedies of our failed political system, going back to even before independence, is that those in positions of power and authority have never invested time in educating the people so that they are ready to play their role as citizens. It's not denying that our people, most of them, are ignorant, naive, and very gullible. A healthy and functioning democracy demands that the citizens should be educated, should be knowledgeable, and should have the diligence to hold those in positions of power and authority to account. A populace that is suffering from personality cult mentality is hardly suitable to hold leaders to democratic account. Indeed, upstarts like Nelson Chamisa are taking full advantage of the people's ignorance. This is going to be a challenge to stop the 2 million or plus who voted for Chamisa in last year's elections, and the 2 million or so others in the diaspora who were cheering and applauding all the way, to stop them doing that again in 2028. But that is the task before us. We have got also some advantages working in our favor. And I believe the very fact that ANC will not be able to play its foolish role that it did assigned for itself to prop up the Zanu PF dictatorship is an important development. One that we must take full advantage of in our fight to end the Zanu PF dictatorship and move Zimbabwe from this economic political crisis. Zimbabwe has had 44 years of rigged elections since independence. Of course, we should hold our heads in shame that in all those years we failed to stop Zanu PF rigging elections. We must make sure we do not make it 48 years of rigged elections. Thank you very much for those who were able to join, and hope will be able to join us again tomorrow, 7 p.m. UK time or 8 Zimbabwe time. Thank you and good night.